Great. Okay, so I'll do a quick welcome. So welcome to our alumni. I'm really glad to see so many people have joined us for our second session on Sherlock Holmes, and I'm now delighted to hand over to Dr Catherine Wynne, who will be leading the session. So Catherine, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thanks for having me back. And it's so nice to see some familiar faces here again from the last time. And this one we're doing tonight is Sherlock Holmes in the City, and it was suggested that we do the Adventure of the Redheaded League, and that's something I'm doing. So I thought we'd think about it, because the Redheaded League is it's a wonderful city story by Sherlock Holmes. I thought we'd look at that in conjunction with another great one, The Man with the Twisted Lip, which of course is another city story. So I thought I'd put those two together tonight for a discussion. Sherlock Holmes is so rich. I've learned new things. I learned something yesterday, which I'll share with you a little bit later as well. Now, I do have a PowerPoint, and I will stop at various points to maybe to interact or to talk about things. I have a lot of material, so you have to forgive me because I got overexcited by this because I had such a wonderful time the last time. I got a little bit overexcited, so I might have quite a bit of material to get through, but I will try to be brief. Now, in my intro, in the introductory parts of it. Now, what we discussed last time, we know who Conan Doyle was. Many of you are very, very familiar with Conan Doyle, but I want to take a particular period in Conan Doyle's life, and this is very significant for the development of these stories, which become the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And two of those adventures, of course, are the Redheaded League and the Man with the Twisted Lip. So where are we, and where is Conan Doyle placed in the context of the city? And I'm talking about London at this particular moment in time. Where is he? He's 31 going on 32 in 1891. His birthday is in May. But where is Conan Doyle located? What change has he made? What radical changes he made in his life in the previous few months? Now, Sherlock Holmes, up to 1890, for about 8 years, he was a doctor in Southsea, which is a suburb of Portsmouth. They might not call it a suburb, but it's beside Portsmouth. It's a suburb of Portsmouth. And he practiced as a GP for about 8 years. Okay, so he's married. He's a GP. He has a daughter, Mary, little toddler. And now I'm going to do a screen share. And just bear with me while I screen share my PowerPoint. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint, and we're going to start with this. So where is Sherlock Holmes? And this is just the introductory part, Sherlock Holmes in the City. Well, Sherlock Holmes leaves, because everybody see that, and is everybody okay? Can somebody shout out they're okay there?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. So Sherlock Holmes leaves Southsea, leaves 8 years in medical practice on the 18th of December, 1890. He decides he's going to stretch himself a little bit. So what does he decide to do? He wants to specialize, and this is really critical, I think, to Sherlock Holmes. And he decides he wants to study the eye. So he becomes, in an old-fashioned terms, an oculist, trains to be an oculist. This is a critical period in Conan Doyle's life, and it feeds into the development of Holmes as we see Holmes over the course of the next year as he develops. He gets his birth, as it were, in the Strand magazine as he starts publishing the Holmes stories in the Strand magazine. So he decides to leave Southsea, hands over his medical practice, and in January he heads off to Vienna to study the eye. Vienna, of course, a great centre of medicine and a great centre for the study of the eye as well in the late 19th century. Now, what might worry some of you is that by the end of March, Conan Doyle was in London, so he didn't spend a lot of time studying the eye, but however, he did set up an ophthalmology practice at 2 Upper Wimpole Street, and he was living at 23 Montague Place. So for those of you familiar with London, this is the heart of London. He's functioning now, he's operating now in the heart of London. He was also attached to Moorfields Eye Hospital. It wasn't called Moorfields then, but he did some work at Moorfields Eye Hospital. Now, why did he spend such a short period of time in Vienna? Well, he discovered that in Vienna, his knowledge of German wasn't good enough. It was a conversational German that he had a grasp of, but he wasn't able to grasp the technical nature of the lecture, so he leaves Vienna early. However, he's not discouraged, and he sets up his eye practice. Now, this critical few months is a period in which he's working on Sherlock Holmes. And he writes A Scandal in Bohemia during this period. his biographer Andrew Lycett argues that he did write A Scandal in Bohemia, probably in this period in Vienna, because it has got a continental influence. But he certainly wrote The Redheaded League in Wimpole Street and 23 Montague Place. And he talks about this as well in Memories and Adventures. He says, every morning I walked from my lodgings at Montague Place, reaching my consulting room at 10, and sat there until 3 or 4 with never a ring to disturb my serenity. Could better conditions for reflection and work be found? It was ideal. And so long as I was thoroughly unsuccessful in my professional adventure, there was every chance of improvement in my literary prospects. Now, he reflects on this in 1924, much later, of course, in his life. And there is some question mark. There is a question mark around whether the practice was quite as bad as he thought, as he's reflecting in 1924. It might have been a little bit busier than that. However, this is what he says in 1924, and certainly we know that he's writing the Sherlock Holmes stories. The first 3 in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in this location, these locations in London. Okay, but that's all very well. And what happens next? He sends them to his agent. He's got an agent called A.P. Watt, and he sends The Redheaded League and A Scandal in Bohemia to A.P. Watt. To A.P. Watt, and A.P. Watt sends them to Herbert Greenhouse Smith, who is the Strand's editor. This is the new publication. So this publication launched in January 1891. So he sends these, or they're sent via his agent, to the Strand's editor. And the Strand's editor recalls this moment as well, much later again in his life. And he says, I at once realized that here was the greatest short story writer since Edgar Allan Poe. I remember rushing into Mr. Newnes's room and thrusting the stories before his eyes. Here was a new and gifted storyteller. There was no mistaking the ingenuity of the plot, the limpid clearness of the style, the perfect art of telling a story. Okay, so that's how he greets these new Sherlock Holmes stories when they arrive at the Strand, on the editor's desk at the Strand. And of course, everybody here will be familiar with the Strand magazine, and you'll see that the offices of the magazine. This is the Strand, a very busy street in the late 19th century. But the offices of the Strand are on Southampton Street, and you can just see there the arrow pointing, or the hand, the index finger pointing to Southampton Street, where the offices were of the Strand. So the Strand comes into being in January 1891, and the Sherlock Holmes stories that are published in the Strand, we know there were 2 published before that. The Sherlock Holmes stories that were published in the Strand develop in these early months as well of 1891. Okay, so what happens to Conan Doyle? He's doing fine. He's writing at Wimpole Street and Montague Place, and suddenly something quite traumatic happens to him. He develops influenza. And he contracts it in May. So what does he decide to do? He decides to abandon his eye practice and move to 12 Tennyson Road in South Norwood. So he moves to the suburbs. Now, this is a critical moment in his life, because he decides from this point onwards, he is going to be a writer. He's going to give up his practice in medicine and his specialism in the eye. One can argue that he's still specializing in the eye, because he's using his knowledge to develop Holmes across the adventures, and of course much later. But this has also got a family dimension as well. He had lost just the previous year.
Sorry, so we've just got a note. Someone's asking if you could hide the where it says hide on the sharing box, just because we can't read the last.
Oh, can you type? Sorry. Oh, hide. Yes, I will do that. Sorry, I didn't know you could see that. I'll do that. So yes, so. He had lost his sister Annette. Annette was a governess in Portugal, and he had lost her sister through influenza. So this was a really traumatic moment for him when he developed this. So he's very ill. So he says, I saw how foolish I was. I'm just about halfway down here to waste my literary earnings in keeping up an oculist room in Wimpole Street. I'm determined, and with a wild rush of joy, to cut the painter and to trust forever in the power of my writing. I remember in my delight taking the handkerchief which lay upon the coverlet in my enfeebled hand and tossing it up to the ceiling, and in my exultation, I should at last be my own master. And really, he never looks back. He is a full-time writer from this moment in time. And this is May 1891. By the end of August, he has moved to Tennyson Road, and in the last week of August 1891, he writes The Man with the Twisted Lip from Tennyson Road, from that address in Tennyson Road. But the eye remains significant, and we see this in a case of identity. So the first three stories that he writes are A Scandal in Bohemia, A Case of Identity, and The Redheaded League. And I just want to draw your attention to the eye in two of these stories. For those of you familiar with A Scandal in Bohemia, you will recall that Sherlock Holmes says in A Scandal in Bohemia, "You see, but you do not observe." And this is what Holmes says this, of course, to Dr. Watson. You see, but you do not observe. And this is while Doyle was studying the eye and practicing eye medicine. But this is also significant in terms of A Case of Identity, also written, as I said, at this period. Do you not find, and this is what Holmes says to a client who comes to consult with him, that with your short-sighted, it is a little trying to do so much typewriting? I did at first, she answered, but now I know where the letters are without looking. Then suddenly realizing the full purport of his words, she gave a violent start and looked up with fear and astonishment on her broad, good-humoured face. You've heard about me, Mr. Holmes, she cried, else how could you know all that? Never mind, said Holmes, laughing. It is my business to know things. Perhaps I have trained myself to see what others overlook. If not, why should you come to consult me? So I just love that. I think it's an absolutely wonderful moment. Again, this is another city text, A Case of Identity, but not one that we're going to be looking at today. So let's look at some of these addresses. This is Wimpole Street, where Conan Doyle wrote The Redheaded League and other stories, and Montague Street, which is Montague Place, which is just behind the British Library, where he lived with his wife and daughter. The Redheaded League was written in both locations and was dispatched to the Strand magazine in April 1891 and was published in August of 1891. And this is the move to South Norwood, to Tennyson Road. And here you've got very much a suburban scene, a middle-class domesticity. Conan Doyle was a keen cyclist. And this is Conan Doyle with his wife. His affectionate name for her was Tui, outside 12 Tennyson Road. And this is where he wrote The Man with the Twisted Lip, which was published in the Strand in December 1891. So a very critical year for Conan Doyle. And this is a lovely moment of, I think, domestic harmony. We know that Tui stabilized him quite a bit, and he was free here to do his writing. He also had a photographic room in this house at Tennyson Road, and he wrote, as we know, photographic essays for the British Journal of Photography, and photography plays a role in the Redheaded League. Sherlock Holmes at this point was very much a family affair. Two of his sisters, Connie and Lottie, who were both governesses as well, helped him. Connie typed the stories up, and Lottie also he wrote from dictation. So they helped him in the in this process of producing these stories for the Strand magazine. So the first 6 stories, and that's all we thought he would do. He thought he would do the first six stories for the Strand magazine, and he was going to park Holmes at that point. He was going to just do up to The Man with the Twisted Lip, and he was going to stop at that point. But in fact, and he was getting £35 a story for them. But at that, then the Strand lured him with the promise of £50 per story, and then he produced a new series of stories after The Man with the Twisted Lip, starting with The Blue Carbuncle from in the autumn of 1891. But we're concerning ourselves with The Redheaded League and The Man with the Twisted Lip, the first 6, and the only 6 that Conan Doyle thought he would produce for the Strand magazine. I'm not going to dwell on this for very long, but I just thinking about, we see very much Holmes associated with the city, and the epicenter of Holmes's world, of course, is Baker Street. Conan Doyle publishes A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four, 1887 and 1890, respectively, in other outlets. But The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes are published in the Strand. And I think just picking up sort of the range there. So, and how he ranges across London, but also extends across the world. Some of these stories have their origins with crime in America, and extend, of course, across Britain as well. Most of the cases, not all of them, and I thought I was just doing a bit of work on this for the last few days, start in Baker Street, but not all of them. The Redheaded League does start in Baker Street. It brings us to the fictitious Saxe-Coburg Square or Farringdon Street. It mentions Fleet Street as well, but it's located very much in the city, in this commercial district of London. The Man with the Twisted Lip brings us into a different part of London. It brings us into the East End, but also brings us into Lee in Kent. And Lee was commuter belt for the late Victorian middle classes. They commuted into London from Lee by train, much similar to today. Bow Street is also mentioned as well. And of these stories, only one story doesn't have any connection at all with Baker Street. It doesn't start in Baker Street, and that is the Boscom Valley Mystery. It starts at Paddington Station, and the crimes are in Herefordshire. Interesting. So there's a variation here, but the epicenter is generally, with the exception of the Boscom Valley Mystery, is Baker Street. I think the variety, however, says a lot about Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. The variety. He doesn't. Although sometimes themes are repeated, such as the missing jewels are repeated, the variety and variation in the stories is absolutely amazing when you actually put them together with all of the places that he documents and visits, or where the crimes come from as well. So just moving on, I just wanted to briefly think about that, because I thought that was an interesting kind of moment to kind of pause and think about the variety and the place. And I also said I would say to you something about Joseph Bell, the influence on Sherlock Holmes. Now, we today always associated Bell with Sherlock Holmes, but in fact, it wasn't until 1892 that Doyle revealed that Bell was actually the influence for this character he created, and who first saw his life in print as far back as 1887. So he reveals this quite late in an article, a now pretty famous article now. If you're working on Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, it's a now kind of standard article. Harry Howe, an article in the Strand magazine in the summer of 1892, reveals for the first time the influence of Bell. So what Doyle does in this article in the Strand magazine, he whips out a picture of Bell and says, "This is the man who influenced my detective." And then he goes on to explain Bell's influence on him when he was a student at Edinburgh University, and how he became Bell's clerk, and he documenting his cases and working alongside him. So this is one example of what Bell does. Cobbler, I see. This is one of the Bell's one of the people who come to see Bell for one of his patients. Cobbler, I see. Then he would turn to the students and point out to them that the inside of the knee of the man's trousers was worn. That was where the man had rested the lapstone, a peculiarity only found in cobblers. So he dedicates when the adventures, all 12 stories, are published in 1892, he dedicates them, of course, to Joe Bell. Joe Bell then comes back and does a review of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and of course he's going to say something nice. The collection was dedicated to him, and now he's associated with this magnificent detective. And he talks about Conan Doyle's education in Edinburgh. Conan Doyle's education as a student of medicine taught him how to observe, and his practice both as a general practitioner and a specialist has been a splendid training for a man gifted as he is with eyes, memory, and imagination. Eyes and ears which can see and hear, memory to record at once and to recall at pleasure the impressions of the senses, and an imagination capable of weaving theory or piecing together a broken chain or unraveling a tangled clue. Such are the implements of his trade to a successful diagnostician. So again, very much linking here the training of a doctor with the training with what Conan Doyle goes on to produce, and of course the great kind of Sherlock Holmes, that he's using his medical training in a particular way. And the eye, of course, is the sense that is that Sherlock Holmes deploys most. The ability to see, not just to see, but also to observe. And how does this work out? Well, this is the text here might be a little bit small here, so I'll read it to you. So how does this work for us with one of the cases that one of the stories that we're going to look at, one of the cases that we're going to look at, the Redheaded League. And that's towards the bottom of the first column there, but I will read it for you because it might be a little bit small to read. And Jabez Wilson turns up, and this is something that Conan Doyle does all the time. He has Sherlock Holmes diagnose the client. What is the client's profession? Just like he could diagnose Mary Sutherland is a typist. He can tell that she's a typist. He can tell that she's short-sighted. So he's diagnosing here who is this individual who has come to consult Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes's quick eye took in my occupation, and he shook his head with a smile as he noticed my questioning glances. And this is, of course, Watson. Beyond the obvious facts that he has at some time done manual labour, that he takes snuff, that he's a Freemason, and he's been in China, that he has done a considerable amount of writing lately, I can deduce nothing else. This is straight from Bell. Mr. Jabez Wilson started up in his chair, with his forefinger upon the paper, but his eyes upon my companion. How, in the name of good fortune, did you know all that, Mr. Holmes? He asked. How did you know, for example, that I did manual labour? It's as true as gospel, for I began as a ship's carpenter. Your hands, my dear sir, your right hand is quite a size larger than your left. You have worked with it, and the muscles are more developed. Well, the snuff, then, and the Freemasonry. I won't insult your intelligence by telling you I've read that, especially as rather against the strict rules of your order, you use an arc and compass breastpin. Ah, of course, I forgot that, but the writing, what else can be indicated by that right cuff, so very shiny for 5 inches, and the left one with the smooth patch near the elbow, where you rest it upon the desk? Well, but China. The fish which you have tattooed immediately above your right wrist could only have been done in China. I have made a small study up to 2 marks, and have even contributed to the literature of the subject. The trick of staining the fish's scales of a delicate pink is quite peculiar to China. When in addition I see a Chinese coin hanging from your watch chain, the matter becomes even more simple. Mr. Jabez Wilson laughed heavily. Well, I never, said he. I thought at first that you had done something clever, but I see that there was nothing in it after all. So of course, it's quite an interesting exchange, because he's taking, you know, his final remark, Jabez Wilson's final remark, and is how simple this is. And of course, Holmes is, as Holmes does. Holmes is showing off, as Holmes does. But this is the influence of Bell. Whether he could read that much into the body is questionable. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause at that moment, and just I'm going to stop sharing for a second, if I can, and I'm going to just see if there are any questions or comments so far. I'm just going to come out of this and go back into the have I stopped sharing? I'm going to stop sharing and just come back and see if there are any questions or comments so far on that before we get into a study of the Redheaded League and the city. So we're going to look at some passages from the Redheaded League pertaining to our theme of the city.
Hi, Catherine.
Hello.
I was just wondering, you mentioned that he was paid £50 for the second set of stories. I was wondering how valuable that was at that time.
Now, that's an interesting one, because if you go on to the, which I'll try and do, but I think if we go on to the National Archives currency converter, if anybody has got their Google up there, you can actually put in how much would £50 be. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not an exact measure, but again, there's something I haven't done, but it's the national. Somebody might be able to do it while I'll try and do it while I'm talking to you, but that's a bit I'll just see if I can multitask there. So you put in the currency converter, and then you can see how many horses you would be able to get for £50 at least. Anybody done it? Yep. So it's National Archives currency. I'm typing with one hand, so it is taking a bit longer than normal. So the currency converter, it's in the National Archives. I'll just put in the year. It does all sorts of years here. I'll just put in, it does them in blocks of 10. So let's do 1890, and let's put in £50. And let's see what comes up there. And it shows the purchasing power. You can buy 1 horse for £50. Depends on what quality of a horse, of course. 5 cows, 92 stones of wool, 39 quarters of wheat. And what they're saying, and again, you have to take this, you know, this thing, currency varies approximately. In 2017, this is worth approximately, according to the National Archives, £4,102.47. So it's not bad for a short story, I would say. but it's you would get, I suppose it's easier to see it in terms of the wages of a skilled tradesman. You would get a skilled tradesman to work for you for 151 days for £50. I think that might put it into sort of into context a little bit better.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, so quite interesting, isn't it? The National Archives are very interesting for that. It's hard for us to conceptualize that, but they gave us an idea of what his earning power would have been from Sherlock Holmes in 1891. Any other thoughts, comments?
You mentioned, Catherine, the locations in the stories, including Lee in the county of Kent, which is, I believe it's now near Lewisham, isn't it? Is that right? Is that the right Lee?
I don't know that, but
no,
yes, Lee, but yes, it is.
I have a coincidentally, I have a Hull graduate friend who lives, whom I'm still friendly with, who lives at Lee. That's a nice coincidence. Where friends are made for life. But no, I was going to recommend for those who want to see what the locations looked like, I recommend the BFI version, the Douglas Wilmer version of the Adventures, which actually goes back to the early 1960s and mid 1960s television productions, when a lot of the houses which are now demolished he refers to, both the commercial and the residential ones, were still in existence. And that's if somebody wants to go and see the houses, as they were rather than as they are now, because they're completely different now. I recommend the BFI collection with Douglas Wilmer as Sherlock Holmes.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Christopher.
Yeah.
That's very useful, because I think what I get a lot from the last one that I did, the last Sherlock Holmes one, and this one, is that you acquire new knowledge when you go back to it, and people's contributions to this it's really, really useful. So I'll be checking those out, certainly, in terms of the locations and seeing what they actually looked like at that particular in the late 19th century. That's very useful. Thank you very much for that.
Catherine, we've just got a few messages in the text chat box. Stephen suggests that for a short fiction of similar length today, you're lucky to find a present-day market that will pay as much as $400.
Oh, so he's doing very well then.
Mark says, was there any indication that Doyle considered giving Holmes a medical background to account for his observational powers?
Now that is really interesting, isn't it? Because I think that's something that we need to consider, because he decides to give the medic in this, of course, is Dr. Watson, but Dr. Watson does not see or observe in the ways that Conan Doyle was trained. So he doesn't have the advantage of that type of medical training that Doyle, or he doesn't give him the type of background that Doyle has. He gives him a military background, of course, in Afghanistan. But yeah, so I think he uses Watson in a particular way to be the doctor, but then he creates this the detective who has these observing powers, but is to some degree self-taught through experimentation, because the first time he meets him, of course, in a study in Scarlet, he is in the lab of I think it's St. Bart St. Bart Hospital, yeah. And he's learning his learning his skills, isn't he? And then he details what Holmes knows and what Holmes doesn't know. And of course, as we reread the canon, as we call it, we realise that Holmes does know a lot more than Watson is suggesting in A Study in Scarlet. But what he does, what is fascinating when I started looking into that as well, is what Bell has to say about the police. And he's not very flattering towards the police, and he says the police actually need to be trained like doctors are trained to observe. But it is quite an interesting moment, because it's if we think about ophthalmology, I won't go on about this too much, but that starts to become a sort of a specialism only around 1850. But also what's happening at this moment in time as well, around 1890, I think it was December 1890, I could be slightly wrong with that, it's in my notes, that Scotland Yard moved premises as well. And what you get a lot of detail in the press at that point is how professionalized the service is becoming, with electric lighting, kind of new technologies in New Scotland Yard as well. But certainly that the idea, yes, he doesn't seem to have thought of doing that, but actually uses the doctor figure, who is more like the conventional policeman, like the Lestrade figure instead. Yeah, it is an interesting point though, about that, why he decides to do that. I don't actually know why he decides to make him effectively self-taught, self-educated. You know, there is an idea that he's, you know, been to university, but we don't know very much about, we don't know anything about his background. So Anna, sorry?
You were saying about St. Bart's.
Yeah.
Well, apparently the Sherlock Holmes Society actually put a plaque in the real St. Bart's commemorating it, the meeting.
Yeah. It's great, isn't it? The plaques are great, aren't they? There are plaques all over the place. There are plaques to Holmes and there are plaques to Conan Doyle, so it gets very confusing. I haven't seen that plaque, but it'll presumably be online. I haven't seen it in reality. Annabelle just says that short story fiction got a lot of traction up until maybe the 1960s or so, during the proliferation of magazines and news. Yeah, again, that's something that's really important, the kind of the heyday of the news. This was a great period, the 1890s, of the newspapers. George Newnes had set up a newspaper called Titbits, then he launched The Strand, and this opened up all sorts of opportunities for people to write. Now, the thing about Conan Doyle is, and I think for people who are writers as well, is that he actually studied the market, and he studied what was being written, and he studied the marketplace. So he knows. He did actually have a publication called The Voice of Science, not Sherlockian story, published in The Strand, in the first volume of The Strand, before he published Sherlock Holmes in it. But he studies the market. He studies Poe, as we know, but the great influence, and I think and somebody we just kind of glance over when we don't actually think about, is Emil Gaboreo. And actually, if you want to read something, and he's quite hard to get now unless you get him on Abe Books, is Emil Gaboreo. And he writes about that, and he says the influence on him was Emil Gaboreo and his stories, and the Victorians in England were reading Gaboreo at that point as well. But yes, the heyday of the newspapers, and of course that's a great moment, and it opens up all sorts of doors for women as well, women who become typists too, and journalists at this period as well. So it's harder to sell short fiction now. Yeah, no, he was at a particular moment in time, yes, but he worked at it, he thought about it, he considered it. Something that was recovered in around 2011 was a manuscript that Conan Doyle had thought was lost, but was recovered and was published by the late John Lennonberg and others. It was called The Narrative of John Smith, and that's quite interesting because here he's talking about this character John Smith, who's got gout, and there are elements of what is going to develop. This is written in the 1880s, only published I think in 2011, but there are elements of the development of Sherlock Holmes in the narrative of John Smith. So very interesting. Right, okay, we go back in again, and that was great. Thanks very much for that. That's really good. I think it's really useful to just to interact with it as well, and just see where we're going. I'm just going back into share again. And I will hide the sharing button, and I will start from, so we departed for a moment from the Redheaded League and back into the Redheaded League again, and I will do we'll stop again and talk about things again as well, and then we'll have room for questions too at the end. This is it. I love this. I love these two pages. It's 198 and 199. I love these two pages because it talks about the city. Now, what's going on here is, of course, not only the overground, but the underground, because we know that Clay is digging underground, pretending to be, of course, he's pretending to be a photographer, using the cellar of the pawnbrokers in this context, but in fact, he's digging out his way to the city and suburban bank. So I'm really fascinated by this idea of the overground, but also the idea of the underground as well. And that moment in there that we capture here with Holmes and Watson, with Sidney Paget outside Jabez Wilson's shop. And this is a critical moment in Holmes' discovery of what is going on. Just have a couple of things here. I just wanted to kind of draw attention to a few things that might be interesting. Just the second paragraph there in 198. We travelled by underground as far as Aldergate, and a short walk took us to Saxe Coburg Square, the scene of the singular story which we had listened to in the morning. Of course, that was the story that Jabez Wilson reveals to them. It was a poky little shabby genteel place where 4 lines of dingy 2-storied brick houses looked out into a small railed-in enclosure where a lawn of weedy grass and a few clumps of faded laurel bushes made a hard fight against a smoke-laden and uncongenial atmosphere. So the sense here, this is a down at heel, of course, for quite obviously a down at heel place here. This square is down at heel. But moving on a little bit then from that, and thinking about what Holmes decides to do. So we see the Jabez Wilson in white letters, and then Sherlock Holmes stops in front of it with his head on one side and looked it all over with his eyes shining brightly between puckered lids. Then he walks slowly up the street and then down again to the corner, still looking keenly at the houses. So this idea of how I really love these passages in this particular story, because it's how that he's navigating the cityscape here very interestingly. Finally, he returned to the pawnbrokers, and having thumped vigorously upon the pavement with his stick 2 or 3 times, he went up to the door and knocked. It was instantly opened by a bright-looking, clean-shaven young fellow who asked him to step in. "Thank you," said Holmes. "I only wish to ask you how you would go from here to the Strand." Third right, fourth left," answered the assistant, promptly closing the door. "A smart fellow that," observed Holmes as we walked away. "He is, in my judgment, the 4th smartest man in London, and for daring I am not sure that he has not a claim to be the 3rd. I've known something of him before." "Evidently," said I, "Mr. Wilson's assistant accounts for a good deal in this mystery of the Redheaded League. I'm sure that you inquired your way merely in order that you might see him. Not him. What then?" "The knees of his trousers." "And what did you see?" "What I expected to see." "Why did you beat the pavement?" "My dear Watson, my dear doctor, this is a time for observation, not for talk." And so a lovely moment here, lots of things going on in terms of the sort of the topography of the city, but also what he wants to see, of course, is not Clay's face, but Clay's trousers. And the trousers are not the trousers of someone engaged in photography, they're the trousers of someone who is making a tunnel. So this ability to see and to observe and to make sense of his surroundings is something that, of course, we associate with Holmes. And I want to just move slightly farther down there, and I just want to pick up some references which I think are quite interesting and come up much later in the Holmesian canon. And he goes on to say, "We know something of Saxe-Coburg Square." But just before he says that, "My dear doctor, this is not a time for observation. We are spies in an enemy's country." And I want you to ponder that for a moment. I want you to think about that reference to Saxe-Coburg Square and this idea of the spy in the enemy's country. And just before kind of stop that, I just want to think about another thing that I want to think about is this idea of what else does he see around him? And I just want to move on to 199 for that. "Let me see," said Holmes, standing at the corner and glancing along the line. "I should like just to remember the order of the houses here. It is a hobby of mine to have an exact knowledge of London. There is Mortimer's, the tobacconist, the little newspaper shop, the Coburg branch of the City and Suburban Bank, the vegetarian restaurant, and McFarlane's carriage building depot." Now, what intrigued me when I used to come to this story was this idea of the vegetarian restaurant. And I'm just going to stop there, and I'm going to leave you to think about 2 things: Saxe-Coburg Square, the enemy country, and the vegetarian restaurant. So I'll just come out of that again and stop sharing for a minute and think about that. Any thoughts on that? The enemy's country and Saxe-Coburg Square, what's the reference to there? What are we thinking about here?
Have we got a Germanic connection?
There is a Germanic connection. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and of course, true Queen Victoria's husband, but also this idea. Now, it's very, very early to start, maybe, but that's something you might want to consider that kind of. But the later Holmes stories that are published a little bit later are very anxious, aren't they, about the naval treaty, for instance, is one. They're very anxious about connections with continental treaties and treaties being stolen. So this idea, I think this is a very early reference to this possibility of trouble brewing on continental Europe when he's using this. And of course, the criminal here is English born and bred. It's a member of the aristocracy, and there is also this sense of the aristocracy we get. Clearly, the aristocracy, as we know from the Holmes stories, are often seen to be degenerate, and Clay, of course, is represented effectively as mad in this story, isn't he? When he comes out and call me by my proper title when he says to the policeman. So the issues around class are very interesting. Do the Holmes stories eventually end with Holmes going to spy on Germany? Yes, well, yes, they do. So this is 1914, his last bow, absolutely brilliant. He masquerades as an Irish-American Fenian and spies on the eve of war in the setting is 1914. It was published, I think, during the war, 1917. I'd have to check that again, but certainly not published in 1914. Published during the war as to help the war effort. The vegetarian restaurant. Well, I was really intrigued by that, and then I discovered an article which was written in 1888 called "How to Live on a Guinea a Week." Now, again, this goes back to the point that was raised earlier about living in London on a guinea a week, and it said that clerks could live very well on a guinea a week. And you could live particularly well if you went to a vegetarian restaurant. And in summertime, you should have 2 meals a week at a vegetarian restaurant. In winter, probably just 1, but they were cheaper, the vegetarian restaurants. But you could almost map these locations because, the carriage, the place where the carriages are, the tobacconist, you can map these onto kind of a contemporary cityscape. You'd have the taxi rank now. You go to get your taxi rather than your hansom cab. But I think that's quite interesting. Right. So I just want to go back in there again and just have another just to go back in, have a look again, and I'll share again, and then we'll think about some of the other things that come up here. Right. Okay, so I'm going to ask you another question, and I'm just going to leave you to I won't come out of the screen share again for that, but if there are any other observations on that, just going back to this idea of I'll just go back, sorry, from current slide. So we're just going to go back to the vegetarian restaurant, the City and Suburban Bank, the carriage building depot, all of these things, Mortimer's, the tobacconists. And I think sometimes this kind of emergence of a world that we are familiar with, we see this very much in the Holmes stories from 1891. Now, for those of you who are, I'm going to ask you later on, Christopher, the question, so you can ponder this towards the end. Why the story? The interest in this story. I'm going to ask you to comment on that at the end of the session, please, if you don't mind. You don't have to. But what was intriguing for me as well was another reference to, and of course we all sort of look at our notes at the back, and I'm just looking at the Oxford World Classics edition by Richard Lansell and Green here. I'm just going to read from that now. Remember, to the Redheaded League, an account of the bequest of the late Ezekiel Hopkins of Lebanon, Pennsylvania. There is now another vacancy open which entitles members of the League to a salary of £4 a week for purely nominal services. Of course, you have to have red hair. But why Lebanon, Pennsylvania? Now, does anybody know the answer to that? Because if you do, and you've read it before, what is the connection? Why Lebanon, Pennsylvania? If you don't, I will reveal it now. You can look it up. Lebanon, Pennsylvania became famous in 1878 for a murder case which involved taking out life insurance policy on the victim, an elderly man called Joseph Raber. At the trial, the group of 6 defendants became known internationally as the Blue-Eyed Six, as all had blue eyes. The case was unusual in that all 6 were tried together for the murder. So again, the references here that you would probably, when reading the story, you might not have noticed. But then this kind of association, which of course Conan Doyle has clearly kind of read about. But again, it's a similar context here. When you think about, we can think about Jabez Wilson here. He was very lucky to get away really with his life. Okay. I'm just going to move on then to thinking about the other story that we are considering here today, and I think we could have probably just done one. I told you I had too much stuff. Apologies for that. I just got overexcited. What I tend to do is the other story, which is set very much in the East End, is a story about begging and opium dens, and this is a very interesting. I love this story. I find this really, really interesting. And what I think this story does, and both the Man with the Twisted Lip and the Redheaded League do very well, is demonstrate Holmes's able navigation of the city. So with the Redheaded League, he explores the pathways behind the shabby genteel square where the pawn shop is located, revealing Victorian life with its swarm of pedestrians, as well as Clay's Target, the City and Suburban Bank. Now, The Man with the Twisted Lip, of course, opens with a disguised Holmes in an East End opium den into which Watson enters on a medical mission to rescue one of his patients. And Holmes, at this moment, showing that he's got great powers, just as someone there referenced his last bow, he would have made a great actor. He turns to Watson, and Watson sees that this figure pretending to be an opium user is in fact Holmes, and then he turns back to his audience, to those who might notice in the opium den, and he's back into role again, and how he moves back from looking at Watson and Watson recognizing him as Holmes back into the role of the opium addict again. So I think this is really, really interesting, and his face has this mobility. And he takes this, Doyle, I think, is taking this from Gaboreo's detective. He's a police detective called Lecoq. For those of some of you may have, I do recommend. These are great stories. They're a lot of fun. Emil Gaboreo's Lecoq, and Lecoq has that ability, ability to change identity and to very, very quickly. He also has the mobile face that Holmes is demonstrating here. So what does he change in front of Watson's eyes, from an inert opium smoker to alert detective, and back again to a state of, and this is from the quotation of the text, doddering, loose-lipped senility. Now, the story, of course, is articulating ideas about opium dens and begging. Begging, for much of the 19th century, was seen, people who begged were either seen as, classified as either the deserving or the undeserving, and that destitution was a form of moral failing. And the other dimension to this is this idea of the opium den, which we see referenced across in stories set in opium dens across Victorian literature as well. And both begging and opium dens were seen as kind of social evils, were much discussed in the periodical press, the press that of course Doyle was reading. So you had and of course we had, with the opium den, we've got the association not only with The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens, but with Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Conan Doyle had read Dorian Gray and had commented to Wilde about Dorian Gray, how much he liked Dorian Gray. And just the last line there were opium dens where one could buy oblivion, dens of horror where the memory of old sins could be destroyed by the madness of sins that were new. So then you've got these social reformers, kind of early kind of ethnographers called Victorian ethnographers, who used to visit these opium dens, and this is of course the role that Sinclair originally takes. He's a journalist. He's exploring begging in London, and then he realizes that he's going to make much more money as a beggar than he is as a journalist. So he's using his dramatic powers, because he has training in acting, to perform this role of beggar. Now, what I think is really interesting about this story is, and you can disagree because I'm just with me as well. I mean, there's a few things I want to look at, but I think what's really interesting about The Man with the Twisted Lip is how it's a story set partially in Lee in Kent. That's where he's living, and this nice, comfortable middle-class existence. But how this middle-class existence that he creates in the countryside is built from his underworld activities as well. St. Clair also has an aristocratic sounding name, and I would argue, again, you can disagree with me, that that St. Clair here is really a parasite feeding off the inequities of empire. So I think this is a really interesting kind of story about social mobility, about the world of Holmes, how we can read this story in various ways. But I think what Conan Doyle is articulating here, to some degree, is what happens in these opium dens, where they are in the Victorian period. They were places where migrant labouring lascars who were underpaid and unexploited went to spend their money, and I think if we think of St. Clair posing as a beggar, he's actually exploiting the victims of a social class already. He is an exploiter, and these beggars are of course already exploited by the social thinkers who categorize them either as deserving or undeserving. And I think what's really interesting about the story, I was just going to look a little bit more at the story, is not only the representation of the opium den, which Doyle, of course, inherits very much from Edwin Drood and from Dorian Gray, and how this is described very much in these terms of kind of vile alley lurking behind the high wharves, a slop shop, a gin shop. So there is a great deal of social deprivation here, and a low room, a brown opium smoke. Now, he would have read about all of these things in the contemporary press, and what is very so we have on one level this depiction of the kind of opium den, and then on the other level we've got this figure who is using these dens and performing the role of beggar to kind of service his comfortable life in Kent. So something to kind of think about as well. So what does Holmes do kind of at the end of this as well? But I just want to take up this idea here. Just the first column here. Some years ago, to be definite, in May 1884, there came to Lee a gentleman Level South Clare by name, who appeared to have plenty of money. He took a large villa, laid out the grounds very nicely, and lived generally in good style. By degrees, he made friends in the neighbourhood. In 1887, he married the daughter of a local brewer, by whom he has now 2 children. He had no occupation, but was interested in several companies and went into town. And that he has a very good bank account, which we know here. He's got a very good bank account. So his earnings, of course, are from begging on the around the banking district in London. So what I think is, there are a couple of things that are interesting here, and one of them, I think, and we come to it at the very at the passage at the very end, is what does Holmes force him to do? And I think Holmes, of course, takes his sponge, his Gladstone bag, which is normally associated with, of course, the doctor, and he cleans St. Clair's face. So that act of cleaning, I think, is forcing, I would argue, is forcing him back to acknowledge his, his middle-class identity, and that he has to go back and actually earn a living through appropriate means, and not through kind of this inappropriate work that he has taken on, this begging. Now, I think this story is, the way Conan Doyle writes it, is quite a socially advanced story, in that it is exposing sort of middle-class hypocrisies. And I want to think about, for a moment too, and again, you can disagree with me, we will have discussion on that. And I also want to think about Mrs. St. Clair. And I want to think about her in the context of someone who is, and women's, these are not really stories that are centered on women. Some of the stories, of course, the Sherlock Holmes stories are centered on women. Women are clients. But Mrs. St. Clair does actually employ Holmes, of course. But her confident navigation of the city. Not only does she navigate the city, collecting a package at the docks, but when she comes back and she sees a figure in a window of an opium den that she thinks is her husband, she actually tries to, tries to cross the threshold and enter into this space. So on one level, I'm really interested in women's navigation of the city, and how they're beginning to expand their worlds, not only becoming typists like Mary Sutherland, but going abroad in the daytime into places of London, conducting their business. Okay, so this is something that they're beginning to extend into the city. But I was also struck when I was looking at Doyle's description here of this at the very end, and the representation of it by Sidney Paget, because sometimes what Paget draws on, and here, of course, the other image here is of Sherlock Holmes looking at the, in the opium den. But this moment here, I'm quite interested. So she tries to get past the guardians of the opium den, who are obviously trying to keep St. Clair's identity secret. They try to prevent her from entering into the den. So what the description here by Conan Doyle is, she attempted to ascend the stairs which led to the first floor. At the foot of the stairs, however, she met this Lascar scoundrel of whom I have spoken, and who thrust her back, and aided by a Dane who acts as an assistant there, pushed her out into the street. So in Conan Doyle's description there, she is being pushed out of this place by a Lascar and a Dane. But when we look at Sidney Paget's image here, we just see the Lascar. Now, I'm just going to leave that with you to ponder, because I think that's a really interesting kind of why he chose to just present the Lascar here with this English woman who's trying to gain entry into this space. The Dane is absent. I'm just going to leave you that to ponder for a minute as well, that maybe there's a sometimes a disjunction between the narrative and the image as well, or how do they play alongside each other and how would they be received by the Victorian reading public. And the last image to leave you with, of course, is that of St. Clair being forced back into his into the role and the world he actually belongs to, which is, of course, the middle class. And what he says here is, what an exposure, what can I do? Sherlock Holmes sat down beside him on the couch and patted him kindly on the shoulder. If you leave it to a court of law to clear the matter up, of course, you can hardly avoid publicity. On the other hand, if you convince the police authorities that there is no possible case against you, you do not know that there is any reason that the details should find their way into the papers. And then he explains why he does this, as we kind of talked about, as I discussed a few moments ago. It's very much associated with his early career as a journalist, and he went out and he was commissioned to do a story on begging, and becomes a beggar himself. So I'm just going to leave it there and get you to think about some of those ideas. I'm going to just very briefly talk about Loveday Brook at the very end as well. So I'm just going to come out of this and see if there are any observations on, and I mean, the beauty of Holmes is you can interpret him in all sorts of ways. I'm just going to stop sharing here. Have I stopped sharing? Yeah, I think, have I stopped sharing? Yeah, I'm back. Okay, so. Yeah, so there are a number of questions here on this.
Yeah, one question, Catherine, is at what point does Mrs. St. Clair know exactly what her husband's been up to? How early in the narrative does she realise that?
She doesn't know at all. Yeah, she doesn't know until I presume until it's revealed to her. Whether it's, is it actually ever revealed to her at the end of the story? Yes, that's a really good point. I don't know, because
it does. Sherlock Holmes or Dr. Watson, do they reveal to her? I don't think we're told in the story.
No.
So presumably she's just thinking he's an innocent victim of crime, and she's very pleased to see him back. And she she doesn't think he's guilty of anything. Just she doesn't know what he doesn't know if he's guilty of anything. That's what because it's not mentioned in the narrative, is it? I don't think.
No, it's a fascinating one, because he's revealed in both streets. Yeah.
I mean, we know what he's been up to, and that he was, he was guilty of various misadventures, but his wife, Mrs. St. Clair, is innocent of that, isn't she?
Yeah.
Doesn't he say he's not worried about his wife finding out? It's the children. So he probably did confide it to her afterwards.
Well, she's a very able woman, Mrs. St. Clair. I find her a very interesting figure, because she's somebody you don't really focus on, but she's a very able woman, because she does obviously consult with Holmes. Holmes comes down to Lee and Kent, and she says to Holmes, there's a moment in it when he comes down to Kent, and she says to him, "Oh, tell me, Holmes, do you think my husband is dead or not?" And he said, "Yes, madam, I think your husband is dead." And she said, "Well, I got this letter from him, today, and it's this, so it's quite interesting how she functions in the text, and she's, she tries to force her way into this space because she thinks believes her husband to be in danger, and she tries to force her way into this space, and she has to be physically removed from it as well by these two men. So she's a very interesting figure, and I think she's, although we don't give her very much attention, Mrs. St. Clair, I think she's speaking to a broader narrative about women's kind of navigation of the world. But what she does with her husband afterwards is an interesting one. Just a couple of things here, and just Doyle hints at the contemporary view of the foreign invading the English as opium as contaminant, especially the perceived threat from Asia at the time in England. Yes, so there is this idea that you get in these stories as well about the opium dens of the foreign, and what do we do about these kind of opium dens as well. I'm just going to move back here. Yeah, I just see how far we need to go back. There's loads of here. Annabelle, the Man with the This sounds like a very fun, silly story, and love it for that reason. Yeah, I just love it because you've got the social world that kind of ties into, and Lydia, you have done some work on this, of course, but the kind of he's tapping into the mystery of Edwin Drood. He's tapping into ideas around opium, and of course, and he's also tapping into the Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray. But the idea of how he's revealed, how he's an actor, how he's performing, how he's revealed in the story. It's one of my favourite stories. I do like it a lot. David, having read some of the Holmes stories for the first time, I noticed they were a lot more deliberately comedic than I realised as a younger reader. Yes. Yes, and how Holmes performs is very comedic as well. Holmes's performance is very comedic. We see that in the Redheaded League when he's showing off. He's very much showing off. Oh, you're clearly kind of a member. You're a Freemason. You know, you've been to China. He's showing off. He's quite a, you know, the comedy in that and the enjoyment that we get from that, I think, it certainly needs to be noted. Do you think Doyle drew on any ideas? Yes, absolutely. The Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has developed in Holmes' character. Yeah, he is a very edgy character, Holmes, isn't he? Because we know that he takes cocaine, and we know that he takes cocaine. Although he tries to come off that habit. So that's very much the Holmes of the 1890 we see in The Sign of Four, that he's using stimulants. And very much tying into kind of these ideas. We know he's got art in the blood, as we know when we go into the memoirs. I think it's the Greek interpreter that talks about art in the blood is liable to take the strangest of forms, and he's got art in his blood. He's got a French artistic ancestor. But yes, the duality, the possibility. Now that goes into all sorts of interesting ways to think about how does he know the criminal so well? And one can argue, Mark, I think really that he becomes the criminal to some degree. He can inhabit the criminal's mind, and we see that very clearly in the Hound of the Baskervilles. Is a beautiful kind of exposition of that. He inhabits the criminal's mind in order to outwit the criminal. So again, I think it's beautifully done in the Hound of the Baskervilles. Yes, and the cocaine, because when he is bored, he seeks stimulants. The Lecoq is developed. Yes, I love Lecoq. I'd love to see what you think of Lecoq. Lecoq is fun. I mean, it's quite. Some of them are, they're long books. The Lecoq books. They're a lot of fun. Yes, James. The Kate Whitney figure and the Mrs. Sinclair figure. That's brilliant. I hadn't thought about that. The comparison between them, that she has to send Watson into the opium den to get her husband out of the opium den. So there is a contrast between the woman who is kind of becoming an active, very mobile figure, as Mrs. Sinclair is, and Kate Whitney. So very, very interesting. That's a really good point. I really
something else I wanted to ask about Mrs. Sinclair. When she's saying, "Oh, I'd know if he was dead because he cut his finger and I knew there was something wrong." Is that Conan Doyle's belief in psychic phenomena poking through?
I think it might be
later in life.
Yeah, no, I mean he's doing that sort of stuff in the 1880s. So when he goes to live in, so he's involved in Portsmouth in this scientific and literary society, and that's where he starts his psychic investigations and activities and becomes really interested in that then. And of course, he follows that through as well when he goes to live in South Norwood. He again joins another literary and scientific society there as well. So yes, no, absolutely. That's emerging with Conan Doyle in the 1880s. Of course, we only know it in its kind of full-blown capacity, as it were, from when he converts publicly just after the war, when he becomes a public convert to spiritualism. Yes, the psychic phenomena, but again, the psychic phenomena is not unusual. Lots of scientists believed in psychic phenomena. They believed in the idea of telepathy, all of these kind of things. They investigated haunted houses. It's kind of, it's aligned with the emergence of psychology in the late 19th century. What is a product of the mind, but what is a supernatural phenomenon? Yes, so lots of interesting stuff going on there. Yes, he's interested in that. Yeah, lovely point there on that as well. Yes, I agree with you. It's coming through there. Yes, Annabelle, the idea of the kind of opium as it's the way, again, they're so rich and open to interpretation, the Conan Doyle stories, and how I might interpret them would be, you know, different for somebody else interpreting them as well. So certainly, I think in the Conan Doyle stories there is this anxiety, a growing anxiety that you see in stories that are coming later, is anxiety about the continent, particularly anxieties about foreign spies. And you know what foreign spies are doing in Britain, and there is in the and I think it is a text that doesn't stand up to scrutiny very well in this current moment in time, and I find it kind of painful to read The Sign of Four, because I think it's, you know, the representation of the Andaman Islander is not acceptable today, and I don't think it holds up at all, the Sign of Four in the ways that some of the other Conan Doyle stories are absolutely brilliant. But there is this kind of sense in that Sherlock Holmes talks about the cesspool of empire, that everybody comes back to Britain in the end. But yes, there is this anxiety about the foreign. But there was also they were setting up a kind of a home for Lascars as well in London. So there were these kind of acts of philanthropy, because many of these figures who were cheap labor on the boats and were, you know, basically dumped off, you know, off at the ports, and, you know, the first port of call would be the opium dens, and that's not unusual for migrant workers. I mean, I think you could say the same thing about the which I'll comment on because I am Irish. You could say a lot about the Irish in the 1960s when they were building the roads in Britain, and they get paid, and then the next, you know, they'd be brought off to the pubs basically in the lorries. They'd drop them at the pub, and they'd spend their checks at the pub. So that type of migrant labor, and then how they're lured into places that are not particularly good for them. But what they tried to do was set up this home for some of these for these migrant workers in London as well, and was partially funded by a rich prince in India, and partially funded by Queen Victoria to provide homes for them. But yeah, but the idea of migrant labor, it doesn't go away, that idea, and we can see it in other communities as well, and we can see it today with other communities as well. So that's, yeah, a point. In the ITV series Jeremy Brett as Holmes, the final scene shows Sinclair burning his beggar's clothes and joining his wife, and the scene ends in them holding hands. Yeah, so that's an interesting one, isn't it? I love Jeremy Brett. I mean, I think he's a marvelous Jeremy Brett, and he is. But yes, so what do you think then? Does anybody want to comment on that? Because the scene ends differently from the novel, so it's a very, going back to middle class domesticity in the end. She forgives him. And the story, as Christopher said, remains open-ended. We don't know, but here there's a sense of closure here. I'm going to work properly anymore. That seems to be what he's suggesting. Is it how we were interpreting Victorian values in I don't know what date that is. It'd be probably the 80s, late 80s, that particular one. Don't know, but is it how we interpret the Victorians as well, to some degree, or how they were interpreted in the late 20th century? Any thoughts? Anybody want to speak about that? I'm going to go back and look at it because I think it's very, very interesting point. I'm going to go back and look at that. Yeah, yes, Annabelle, because you're very harsh on Annabelle, that's right. But you're absolutely right. There's a double standard. Sinclair is effectively let off the end of the story. He's told not to do it again, but is overall presented as sort of, yes. He just gets a little slap on the wrist. Actually, Holmes pats him on the back, doesn't he, in the bit we read? But the Lascar gets a more negative, threatening portrayal. And I thought what was really interesting is that Sidney Paget zoned in on the Lascar, giving him. So there is a Dane and a Lascar who tried to push her out of this place, but it's only the Lascar that they represent. So unless you had kind of read that passage in some detail as a Victorian reader, you might be just thinking that this is an encounter between the Lascar and Mrs. Sinclair as well, but it's actually so I think it is an interesting one to think about in terms of race there, and that Sidney Paget is seeing something in the story and presenting something to the reader, because that we need to kind of think about, but it's a much more negative and threatening portrayal. If a beggar had impersonated a gentleman, it would have been very different. Yeah. Yes.
It's occurred to me, Catherine, that trying to answer Annabelle's question, which hasn't occurred to me before, that she's actually burning his clothes because she's heard rumours about what he's done, but she doesn't want to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
So she's burning her clothes as a sort of is an exorcism, or it's a catharsis.
Yeah.
She's trying to purge herself of any evidence of what he has purported to have done. She doesn't want to believe it.
Yeah. Because there is very much this, again, Jekyll and Hyde idea. It's about the facade, isn't it, as well? About the facade that we have with Jekyll, isn't it, really, as well? There is that facade, and that Hyde is the hidden aspect of, in all sorts of ways, of Jekyll, but very much similar text of the period, isn't it? Oh, fleas, yes, Stephen. Yes, the fleas would have been a bit of a problem as well. Yeah. Annabelle, you want to say? I think you had your hand up there a minute ago, Annabelle. Did you want to say anything?
Yes, I was just going to say as well, with regards to the burning of the clothes in the fireplace, it feels a bit more egalitarian as well, to be honest. It does feel like an update of Victorian values to kind of present her as a more equal partner. In the original story, the feeling I always associated with it was that very kind of, oh, boys will be boys, oh, you know what boys are like. It felt very much as if his behaviour was excused because it was sort of funny and childish. But it doesn't really present much of a very real impact on his wife. It sort of, she's never really given a chance of redress for that. In the same way, Kate Whitney has to sort of put up with the fact that sometimes her husband goes to opium dens. Yeah. Giving the act of showing them, you know, standing hand in hand, burning the clothes together. Firstly, we're explicitly being told, yes, she has been given knowledge of what's happened. She has been accepted as an equal partner in that relationship. And also the implication that he has, you know, perhaps been persuaded into it by her, which is giving her a kind of agency as well.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting point. Yeah, absolutely.
Point. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I think it's you know, I think it's how these stories are so rich, and you go back to them and you think different things at different moments as well. They're so beautifully rich, and this is a beautifully rich story, I think. Okay, so I just want to when in our last meeting, Stephen's going, thank you, Stephen. That's great, thank you. We just mentioned, someone mentioned, what about a female detective? So I just want to very briefly look at Loveday Brooke. Now, I'm not an expert on Loveday Brooke. I just started to work a little bit more on Loveday Brooke for you guys, really, because I was asked to present a female detective. So this is going to be very brief. So I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted, but a couple of things that I know, not from the beginning. I don't want to do the slideshow from the beginning. I'll just go down. So, of course, Holmes had many imitators, and I've just lost. And one of the more famous, and it kind of ties into this idea of the Mrs. St. Clair idea as well that we've been raising, is Loveday Brooke, and she becomes one of these fictional detectives. And this is an image or an illustration from one of the stories, one of the 6 stories in the Loveday Brooke collection, published in book form in 1894. And of course, what you see here is that the illustrator is.
Yeah.
Am I not sharing?
I'm not sure. No, maybe others could see. I can't.
I'm not sharing. Sorry, I forgot to share. That's me. That's me. I just want to show you. It's going to be very brief anyway, because I know we're heading out of time here. So I just me lost the plot and sharing, at the very end. So doing quite well with the sharing until now. So yeah. So she's called Loveday Brooke. And I thought it was quite interesting, and I hadn't noticed this before either when I started with the Loveday Brooke, is that the illustrator here, I'll just take this hide button away, I'll just hide this. The illustrator here is effectively plagiarizing Paget, I think, Sidney Paget, and this is Holmes and Watson in a Train Carriage in Silver Blaze, 1892, and then you've got Loveday Brooke and an inspector, police detective, on the way to the Red Hill mystery, the mystery of the Red Hill Sisterhood. I just thought that was quite interesting in terms of you're not just kind of imitating the kind of it's not just about a detective, albeit a female one, that they're taking the idea from Holmes, but also the sort of illustrators taking that idea on board as well. And let's present them again. This female, very mobile figure. Now, the difference between somebody like Loveday Brooke, the detective, and she belongs to a detective agency, and this is going to be very brief, and Holmes is, what can she do as a female detective Holmes cannot do? Well, she can actually insert herself into people's homes. And in this case, at the murder at Troit's Hill, she actually becomes the secretary to Mr. Craven, who turns out to be mad and is a murderer. So there are elements of this story that speak to some other Conan Doyle stories as well. One of them is Boscom Valley Mystery as well. So that's one of the things that she can do, but it's also kind of tying into kind of new roles and possibilities for women, not only to become, she's a detective, but she's a woman who can work in somebody's home as a secretary as well. So Holmes, of course, cannot insert himself into homes in the same way that this female detective can. So it'd be something maybe some of you might want to follow up. The quality of the stories, of course, are not as good as Holmes. They're not as satisfactory. Aspects of them, I think, socially speaking, are really interesting, but they're not satisfactory. I would suggest they're not satisfactory stories in their own right. They're okay. They're okay. Many of the imitators of Holmes aren't very good. I always think that in relation to Christie. If you read Christie and then you read others who are writing around Christie, and you think, well, actually, Christie's got something different and better. That's my own. But they are written by Catherine Louisa Perkins, who dies around 1910, and so she produces these stories in the Ludgate Monthly, and then she collects them in the Experiences of Loveday Brooke, Lady Detective. And again, in this story, in Drawn Daggers, Loveday Brooke can read a room like Holmes. She knows that somebody has swapped the identity of the person who is supposed to be in the room, but she has swapped places with a maid, and the maid is pretending to be her. And Loveday Brooke realizes that the way in which the room is ordered has the signs of a maid occupying the room rather than a mistress, and she can in the way in which the room is ordered. It's really that's a really interesting one. I think that's a really interesting moment in Drawn Daggers. And of course, Louisa Perkins was also associated with the foundation of what we know today as the Dogs Trust as well. So some people have worked on her, so it might be something that you could maybe some of you'd like to explore them. So maybe some of you have explored her in more detail than this. Okay, so I'm just going to stop sharing that, and just any sort of comments at the end, or anybody like to kind of say anything at the end? Any questions at the end? The arrangement of the rooms is also something else to not pick up on. Yes, it is really interesting, Annabelle. Yes, I just think that's a really interesting moment in the text. And how she looks at the arrangement of the room. I think that one is definitely worth, because it is about swapping identities for a particular purpose, because the mistress, as it were, wants to go off and she wants to go off and marry the man she wants to marry. So she's tricking the people that she comes to. She comes from Australia, and she's tricking the people. Actually, she comes from, it's not Australia. I think she's on, the other person she meets is en route from Australia. I think it might be Singapore she's coming from, and but it's an interesting thing to think about, and not as good as Holmes by any means, but interesting how it's influencing this female detective as well. So any other thoughts then? Some people are needing to leave, and of course we're coming towards sort of the end here. So I enjoyed that very much, and kind of thank you very much for coming to the second kind of Sherlock Holmes event for alumni. Let me know if you'd like to do a third one at any point. We can do that. But thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed doing that this evening.
Thank you, Catherine. That was brilliant once again, really enjoyable, and I personally would love to hear you talk about Sherlock Holmes again. Additionally, maybe even potentially Dracula. I know you mentioned you were going to be on TV talking about Dracula. Is it next week?
Sometime in November. So I just did something last week. Just did some filming in Whitby last week with for a program which is going to be called Britain by Beach, and they're doing the beaches in Britain, and they decided to do Whitby as well. So of course the Whitby connection is Dracula. So yes, happy to do Dracula. I'm doing Dracula tomorrow night. If anybody's in the Brig area, North Lincolnshire, I'm talking about Dracula in a book club tomorrow night for the Rabbit Hole Bookshop, and it's in the Angels Suite. I think it's bookable through the Rabbit Hole Bookshop if you want to do that. But yes, I'll be on TV for Britain by Beach. Happy to do Dracula. And also happy to do The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is my favourite Sherlock Holmes. Happy also to do, if anybody would, a fantastic adaptation of Sherlock Holmes is Michael Chabon's The Final Solution, where Holmes is an old man in wartime Britain. So very interesting. He's not named as Holmes, but a very interesting book as well. But it's lovely having all these ideas. It's very, very useful for me, and I love talking about Sherlock Holmes and Dracula. So.
If people want to let us know what you'd like to see from us, maybe if you want what you want to hear from Catherine, or more broadly what you'd like the masterclass series to do, we do have another masterclass session coming up next week on horror movies, horror cinema, making sense of horror cinema. Why does it make us scared? I think quite appropriate because it's Halloween, although that was actually completely by accident. I'll post that in the chat in case anyone wants to find out more about it. And also, if you want, we do have an event coming up that I've not really advertised widely yet, but we have one of our graduates is coming back to give a talk. It'll be online. He's a crisis negotiator, actually quite a sort of, I mean, he's very modest, so he wouldn't appreciate me saying, but he's had a very, very good career as a crisis negotiator, and he's going to talk to us about listening, empathy, and relationship building, and how that's important in a negotiation. I'm actually really looking forward to that one as well. I've posted that one in the chat again if anyone wants to have a little look, find out a bit more, and maybe book on. But yeah, just wanted to say thank you to you guys as well, because the interaction's been really great, and it's really good to see people who are interested in this. Let us know what you want as well from future events, and if you're interested in maybe an alumni book club, that was something that was suggested that could potentially be something we could take forward. But yeah, let us know. And again, thank you, Catherine, because that was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed rereading the Holmes stories, and to have that bit of context and background. That discussion's been brilliant from my perspective. Annabelle, I think, has got her hand up. I think Annabelle wants to come in and say something.
I think you need to unmute, Annabelle. I think you're still muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you for telling me.
You know, it happens to me all the time.
I'll be quick because I assume people want to get off. Just wanted to say I love the idea of a book club, and I imagine you may well have already done things with them, but I would also love to hear you talk about Neil Gaiman's versions of Sherlock Holmes. He's done 2 short stories that I'm aware of, possibly more, A Study in Emerald and A Taste of Honey. I really enjoyed both. I thought it was a really interesting take on the mythos. And if that was ever something you wanted to talk about, I'd be really interested to hear about it.
Great, thank you. Yes, I think Holmesian adaptations are fantastic, aren't they? Some of them are absolutely fascinating. Yeah, certainly we can, and that might be an interesting one for the book club as well, potentially.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I'd love to talk about it.
I think
that's what people are interested in.
The book club is a great, yeah. I think the book club is what people want to do, David. That's fantastic. I'd love to do that too.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we'll call it a night then, because it is getting on quite late. Thank you so much, Catherine, for giving us the time and so much of your expertise. That has been wonderful, and thanks again to the audience. It's been great, and you've contributed to what's been a wonderful session. So thank you, and good night.